here we go again. For the first time since the 2018 Stanley Cup playoffs, the Pittsburgh Penguins and Philadelphia Flyers will play each other in a playoff series. To say that I am excited would be an understatement. I, as I'm sure many other Penguins fans and Flyers fans, am ready for this series and ready to run through a brick wall as, spoiler alert, I don't like the Flyers. And I'm sure many other Flyers fans don't like the Penguins. This video will be my best effort on an explanation and historical review of the Pittsburgh Penguins and Philadelphia Flyers rivalry. I am a Pittsburgh Penguins fan, so I'm sure there's a huge asterisk on this video given that, there will be some sort of bias in this. But I did try my best to be as even as possible because I really do respect this rivalry in terms of just being one of the best rivalries in not just the NHL, but all of sports. We have a lot to talk about here, and this video is going to be pretty lengthy, so feel free to pause, come back, watch this video in increments. I want to be as thorough as possible here. Forgive me if this video is a little bit longer. And I actually want to start by talking about just the state of Pennsylvania in general and the cultural differences between East and West. I'm not going to go into a huge history lesson here by any means, but Pennsylvania, not being as big as Alaska and Texas or any of those states, still has some pretty definitive cultural differences between East and West. Philadelphia was one of the biggest and most important cities in the nation of the United States, with guys like Ben Franklin coming from there and, the Constitution being signed there and all that stuff. It was settled much earlier than Pittsburgh and was and still is to this day much bigger than Pittsburgh. It's more in line with other cities like New York, Boston, and DC, whereas Pittsburgh was more of an industrial city, obviously producing a ton of steel, and is more culturally aligned with cities like Cleveland and Detroit. So while both cities are in the same state, there is a huge cultural divide in terms of culture, customs, about 5 hours of driving time, and, the Appalachian Mountains. I also want to talk briefly about other sports outside of hockey. Philadelphia has all 4 major sports teams. Pittsburgh only has 3. Not having an NBA team. The Pirates and Phillies have butted heads before, with the Phillies and Pirates going at it in the 70s when the Pirates were actually good. Nowadays, there's different divisions and all that. It's most notably the Poop series now. The Eagles and Steelers haven't been too big of rivalries given that they're both in different conferences and can really only meet each other mostly in the Super Bowl, or whenever the NFL schedules them to play in the regular season. The Flyers and Penguins, much different stories. But actually, one more quick thing I want to mention before we get into these two teams is that the NHL actually had 2 NHL teams in the city of Pittsburgh and Philadelphia before what we know now. The Pittsburgh Pirates, not the baseball team, came into the league in the early 30s and eventually moved to become the Philadelphia Quakers. I have a whole video on that, so feel free to go check that out if you will. Let's finally get into 1967 and the NHL expansion and these two teams that hate each other. So, as I'm sure many of you know, the NHL expanded in 1967, going from a league of 6 teams to 12 teams, with 2 of those 6 expansion teams being the Pittsburgh Penguins and Philadelphia Flyers that are still around to this day. You would expect both of these teams to have a fair playing field in terms of coming into the league and being competitive. Both of them have to go through the expansion draft. But no, the Philadelphia Flyers became a pretty good team right off the get-go, similar to maybe the Golden Knights nowadays, as they got guys like Bernie Parent in the expansion draft and pretty quickly became a Stanley Cup contender, whereas the Pittsburgh Penguins didn't have that, to say the least. Flyers made the playoffs in their first year of existence, whereas it took Pittsburgh 3 years to make the playoffs. Playoffs were way different back then. There was only 12 teams in the league, but still, it took the Penguins 3 years. The Flyers only 1. In 1967, the first ever meeting between these two teams happened on October 19th, and it wasn't that eventful. At the Spectrum in Philadelphia, the Flyers shut out the Penguins 1-0 and won, which started a pretty unfortunate history for the Penguins at the Spectrum in Philadelphia. Bill Sutherland got the only goal for Philadelphia, and Doug Flavell got the shutout in goal. Also notable, in 1969, the Philadelphia Flyers, with the 17th overall pick, took a chance on a guy by the name of Bobby Clarke, who will be important later, as he quickly became the Flyers' best player and arguably is still their greatest player in their history. By the early 70s, the Flyers had a solid core in place, with Clark, expansion draft pick goalie Bernie Parent, Rick McLeish, and Bill Barber. And by 1974, they turned that into a Stanley Cup. Meanwhile, the Pittsburgh Penguins were struggling to really find their footing. They lost a pretty heartbreaking series in the 1970 playoffs against the St. Louis Blues. The year after, Michel Briere tragically passed away after a car accident. And to say the Penguins were struggling at this point, again, would be an understatement. But like I mentioned before, only 7 years into their history, the Philadelphia Flyers won the Stanley Cup in 1974. Thanks to what would be known as the Broad Street Bullies, a level of brashness, we can beat you up on the score sheet and just in a fight, and won the Stanley Cup over the Boston Bruins in 6 games. Bernie Parent won the Conn Smythe. But they weren't done yet, as in 1975 they repeated. The Flyers defeated the Buffalo Sabres, also in 6 games, with Bernie Parent winning another Conn Smythe. In just a few years into their existence, the Flyers had 2 Stanley Cups and were the first non-Original 6 team in NHL history to win the Stanley Cup. In 1976, they continued yet again, going all the way to the Stanley Cup final, but eventually losing to the powerhouse Montreal Canadiens. But Reggie Leach was able to make it out of that series with the Conn Smythe Trophy. This was definitely a golden era in Flyers hockey, as they were not only able to win Stanley Cups, but other individual major awards, too many of which that I'll mention all of them, but most notably, Bobby Clark won the Hart Trophy in 1973, 75, and 76, and Bernie Parent won 2 Vezina trophies in 74 and 75. Keep in mind the Vezina was a little bit different back then. Again, the Penguins at this point were really struggling. They had some good players like Rick Kehoe, Jean Pronovost, and Sil Apps. But in 1975, the same year the Flyers won their 2nd consecutive Stanley Cup, the Penguins filed for their first bankruptcy. Certainly a tale of 2 cities, and at this point, there really wasn't a rivalry just in general. The Penguins' rival at this point could really be the Blues, and the Flyers were a team that was hated by most of the rest of the league. Bobby Clark was kind of the Brad Marchand, Matthew Tkachuk of the era. That's selling himself short. Bobby Clark was better, I would argue, than those players, but he was hated by the rest of the league. But what I'm trying to say is that it wasn't unique that the Penguins and many of their fans and their players hated Bobby Clark and the rest of the Flyers. In the head-to-head series between the Penguins and Flyers in the regular season, the Flyers dominated. Because on February 7th, 1974, and from then until February 2nd, 1989, the Pittsburgh Penguins did not win a single game in the city of Philadelphia. Going 0-39-3 over the course of 15 years. The Flyers continue to be a good team heading into the 80s, even though most of the cast of the Broad Street Bullies slowly started to, go away, as things are in sports. They made 3 Stanley Cup finals in the 1980s, but lost all of them. They lost to the Dynasty New York Islanders in 1980, and then Wayne Gretzky and the Edmonton Oilers in 1985 and in 1987. However, in 1987, Ron Hextall got another Conn Smythe as a consolation prize there. At this point in history, the Penguins had made the Stanley Cup playoffs in general 9 times. The Philadelphia Flyers had been to the Stanley Cup final, so a couple of wins away from hoisting the trophy, 6 times. So again, there really wasn't that big of a rivalry there, as the Flyers were the far better team, but that all changed in 1984, as the Penguins pretty obviously tanked for a guy that went first overall, Mario Lemieux. He would go on to change the Pittsburgh Penguins franchise, obviously, but I would argue he would definitely go on to change the Philadelphia Flyers franchise in general as well. We all know who Mario is. I feel like I really shouldn't have to explain who he is. And for even the Flyers fans out there, I would hope that they would at least acknowledge that he is, without a doubt, the greatest player to ever play in this rivalry. Mario's first game against the Philadelphia Flyers came on October 21st, 1984. It was in Philadelphia, so that means the Penguins lost, and Mario didn't record a point, and it would take a lot more than just Mario for the Penguins to snap that streak. But that's exactly what the Penguins did, slowly over time, and recognizing that Mario was a once-in-a-generation player the Penguins added guys like Tom Barrasso and Paul Coffey and slowly became a more relevant team out of the 80s and into the early 90s. And that leads us up to the year 1989, which up until this point, like I mentioned before, there really hasn't been too much to really convey this as a rivalry. But 1989, that year just in general, I would argue really sparked and created this rivalry in general. On February 2nd, 1989, the Pittsburgh Penguins entered the Spectrum in Philadelphia, a place that they had not won in for 15 years, and finally got the job done and snapped the streak. Some say it was Pittsburgh radio hosts Scott Paulson and Jim Krenn, who quite literally before the game tried to break the curse with a voodoo ritual. Some say it was because of Mario, who did have 2 assists in the game. Others say it was the hockey gods. Nonetheless, the streak was finally broken in Philadelphia, and the Penguins had a win as they won 5-3. But that wasn't it for that calendar year, as of course, in 1989, we got the first ever playoff series between the Penguins and the Flyers. What is most remembered about this series was Game 5, a 10-7, that's 17 goals, that featured Mario Lemieux scoring a hat trick in the first 7 minutes of the game, a total of 130 penalty minutes, and the Penguins grabbing a 3-2 series lead. But the specific moment that everyone remembers about this series was Ron Hextall chasing Rob Brown after he scored a goal. Apparently Hextall had had enough. He gave up 9 goals in that game, and he just decided to chase Rob Brown down after he scored on him. The refs broke it up, and Rob Brown was running away from it. I don't blame him. But it certainly set the stage for the rivalry to grow even further in the coming years. The Flyers ended up prevailing in the series in 7 games, but then they lost the next round against the Canadiens. The Flyers then entered into a 5-year playoff drought, and the script was kind of flipping after the dominant 70s. It was time for the Penguins to shine in the early 90s. So moving on to the 1990s, the Penguins finally put it all together with a dominant Hall of Fame-led team in the early 90s, and similar to the Flyers in the 70s, went back-to-back. In 1991, they defeated the Minnesota North Stars with Mario Lemieux winning the Conn Smythe and the Pittsburgh Penguins winning their first Stanley Cup in team history. In 1992, they repeated, unfortunately without their late coach Badger Bob Johnson, as Stanley Cup champions, defeating the Chicago Blackhawks and Mario Lemieux winning the Conn Smythe yet again. But one thing that I do want to mention that happened in between these 2 Cup years was an enormous 3-team trade that happened between the Penguins, Flyers, and Los Angeles Kings. Oversimplifying things here, the Penguins traded Paul Coffey to the LA Kings for a bunch of pieces that they then added with Mark Recchi, so we got 2 Hall of Famers here in this trade, and they turned around to trade with the Flyers to get Rick Tocchet, Shel Samuelson, and Ken Reggett. Pretty ballsy and controversial trade by then Penguins general manager Craig Patrick, but it worked. As I mentioned before, the Penguins repeated in 1992 without the likes of Coffey and Recchi. So just like that, the Penguins had tied the all-time Stanley Cup leaderboard with the Flyers with 2. And on top of that, they had a prime Mario Lemieux and this young guy by the name of Jaromir Jagr coming up. Similar to what I said with Bobby Clarke and Bernie Parent, I want to read over some awards that the Penguins won in this time. Mario Lemieux won the Art Ross in 1988, 1989, 1992, 1993, 1996, and 1997 as the league's top scorer. Jaromir Jagr also did so in 1995, 1998, 1999, 2000, and 2001. Lemieux won the Hart Trophy as the NHL's best player in 1988, 1993, and 1996, and Jagr also did in 1999. So at this point, the Flyers were probably a little jealous of the Penguins' success, so they really needed their own superstar. Enter Eric Lindros, who the Flyers were able to acquire from the Quebec Nordiques. He quickly became the Flyers' best player, and while he was a great effort by the Flyers, he is nothing compared to Mario. No offense. He did win a Hart Trophy in 1995. Good for him. He was nothing compared to Mario. Mario Lemieux was immortal. Nothing could stop Mario. Yeah, if you're a hockey fan, you should probably be familiar with this story. The ongoing health issues that Mario Lemieux had greatly diminished his career, to say the least. Most famously and most notably, his battle with Hodgkin's lymphoma and his cancer battle. It was an unfortunate circumstance, to say the least, and despite the rivalry, the Philadelphia Flyers and their fans were always really incredibly, surprisingly, respectful to Lemieux's circumstances. In 1993, the Flyers gave Mario a standing ovation after he returned from radiation treatment. The Penguins lost that game 5-4, but again, still to this day, it is remembered as really, they did that moment, as the Flyers fans saluted Lemieux. In 1997, the teams met again in the Stanley Cup playoffs, and jumping ahead here to talk more about Lemieux and his cancer battle, Lemieux ended up leaving the NHL and retiring after that series, and that series ended in Philadelphia, and the Flyers fans gave him a standing ovation in what could have been and what was probably viewed as his last game at that point in time. But in terms of that series in general, in 1997, the Penguins and Flyers met for their second ever matchup in the Stanley Cup playoff. This one also went the Flyers' way, pretty handily in only 5 games. Eric Lindros outscored both Jágr and Lemieux, and the Flyers advanced. That same year, the Flyers went all the way to the Stanley Cup final after beating the Penguins, only to lose yet again, this time to the Detroit Red Wings in a clean sweep. It would go on to be the furthest and closest to a Stanley Cup Eric Lindros would ever get in his career. Heading into the 2000s, both teams remained competitive despite, players moving on and things happening, Lemieux leaving and Lindros eventually having his injury concerns and eventually leaving. But the Penguins, now led by guys like Jágr, Martin Straka, Alexei Kovalev, and the Flyers, now led by guys like John LeClair, Eric Desjardins, and former Penguin Mark Recchi. The teams met again in the 2000 Stanley Cup playoffs. The Flyers won yet again, remaining a perfect 3-0 against the Pittsburgh Penguins in Stanley Cup playoffs. They took the series in 6 games. What, of course, everyone remembers about this series was the game that went into 5 overtimes. Jaromir Jágr totally scored to win the game, and no, that's not what happened. It was Keith Primo. I was an infant, but I'm still mad about this somehow. It was Keith Primo who ended the 3rd longest game in NHL history, and let's be honest here, the other 2 that are ahead of it were in the 30s. It really was the longest game in NHL history, certainly in the modern age. The game lasted 6 hours and 56 minutes, let's call it 7 hours, and ended at 2:30 in the morning in Pittsburgh. And as I mentioned, Keith Primo scored to tie the series with a simple wrist shot. It was a nice goal, and the Penguins really never recovered from that. Games like that in the playoffs that go that long are huge momentum builders, and the Penguins lost the series in 6 games. But after a fun playoff series, even though it didn't go the Penguins' way, another fun playoff series came and went. These 2 teams went in different directions, with the Flyers, just in general, even just their entire history, remaining competitive. Maybe that was a bad thing, because the Penguins didn't remain competitive. They bottomed out, and they stockpiled some pretty good young players. After the lockout in 04-05, the Penguins secured the number 1 overall pick in the 2005 NHL entry draft and selected Sidney Patrick Crosby, the player that will go on to, and still to this day, has the most career points against the Philadelphia Flyers. In 93 games, he has 60 goals, 79 assists, and 139 total points. That's just in the regular season. But he wasn't the only player the Penguins were able to get in their rebuild, retool, bottoming out in the early 2000s. Marc-Andre Fleury was drafted 1st overall in 2003. In the same draft year as Sidney Crosby, the Penguins got Chris Letang. The year before, they got the consolation prize of Evgeny Malkin. Even guys like Jordan Staal and Ryan Whitney, who was eventually traded to become Chris Kunitz. The Penguins had a good young core. And the Flyers, like I said, remained competitive. But before they met in the playoffs, Sidney Crosby, of course, had to make his first game debut against the Flyers. That came on November 16th, 2005, where an 18-year-old Sidney Crosby got a taste of the brotherly love in Philadelphia, as rugged defenseman Darian Hatcher, now playing for the Flyers, understood the assignment and gave Crosby the lumber. There was a specific play where Crosby and Hatcher collided, and Crosby lost 2 teeth. This is where the Cindy Crosby memes and stuff all happened, where Crosby was whining to the refs. I'll even say it as a Penguins fan. He was trying to get a call or whatever. He didn't. There was no call on the play. But Crosby got the last laugh as that game went to overtime. And with the first overtime winner in his career, Crosby scored to win the game against the Flyers. He got the last laugh. And from then on out, and still to this day, Crosby has, even if you're a Flyers fan, you have to admit, he's had a pretty good career against the Flyers. So like I said, the two teams were bound to meet yet again in the playoffs, and they did in back-to-back years. Let's talk about 2008 first. This happened in the conference finals, so the winner of the series gets to play for the Stanley Cup. And for the first time in this video and in history in general, the Pittsburgh Penguins won a playoff series against the Philadelphia Flyers and moved on to go to the Stanley Cup final. They were clearly the better team in this series, beating the Flyers in 5 games and moving on to the Stanley Cup final, where they unfortunately, in my case, lost to the Detroit Red Wings, a veteran team, in 6 games. But you can copy-paste a lot of things into the next year, as the Penguins met the Red Wings in the final, but before then, had to play the Philadelphia Flyers yet again. It wasn't in the conference finals, but it was still as intense as it was in the first round in the 2009 playoffs. The Penguins prevailed in the series. Bill Guerin scored an overtime winner in Game 2, but of course what most people remember about this series was the final game in it, Game 6. The Penguins came in leading the series 3-2 with a chance to advance in Philadelphia, but they found themselves down 3-0 pretty early in the game. That was until Max Talbot decided to pick a fight with Dan Carcillo, who was way out of his weight class, and Dan Carcillo pretty fittingly beat the crap out of him. But Max Talbot sparked the Penguins team with the famous shush, trying to shush the crowd in Philadelphia, which is not a thing you can do. But for whatever reason, that was a huge motivator for the Pittsburgh Penguins, and that was the huge turning point in the game as the Penguins came back, tied the game at 3 before going on to win the game 5-3, eliminating the Flyers on their home ice and moving on to the next round, before eventually rematching those Detroit Red Wings in the Stanley Cup final. And in Game 7, Max Talbot, again, the same shush guy, scored 2 goals, and the Penguins won the 2009 Stanley Cup, the first of Sidney Crosby's career. And just like that, the Penguins had more Stanley Cups than the Flyers. Evgeny Malkin had a fantastic playoff series that year, and he went on to win the Conn Smythe. And also, as I mentioned with Yager and Lemieux and Clark and Perrant back in the day, I want to read over some awards that were won in this time. Individual awards, I'm not going to read them all. But in this era, Sidney Crosby won the Art Ross as the league's top scorer in 2007 and 2014. And Evgeny Malkin did so in 2009 and 2012. Sidney Crosby won the Hart Trophy in 2007, 2013, and Evgeny Malkin did so in 2012. But the Flyers still, like I said before, are always a competitive team for the most part. It's their entire history. They were not a pushover team heading into the 2010s, and the Penguins went to the Stanley Cup final in 2008, 2009, in 2010, they don't. The other Pennsylvania team goes to the Stanley Cup final. The Flyers put together a pretty impressive run, barely sneaking into the playoffs after a very memorable shootout to end the regular season. They go all the way to the Stanley Cup final in 2010, but in typical Flyers fashion, they lose yet again to Patrick Kane's infamous "he only knew it was in" goal. It may very well be the closest Claude Giroux will get to a Stanley Cup. So the Flyers really needed a boost. They were certainly on the verge of a potential Stanley Cup there, so they needed a real boost. And in the 2011 free agency market, they added a player who had a lot of experience, signing a 39-year-old Jaromir Jagr, who came back to the NHL after a couple years in the Russian KHL. This soured a lot of Penguins fans' opinions about him, but it wasn't just Yager, as Max Talbot, remember him, shush, 2 goals in Game 7 against the Red Wings. He also signed with the Philadelphia Flyers, so yeah. And the rivalry was certainly alive, especially after the 2008 and 2009 Stanley Cup playoff series. In 2012, they met yet again, but before they did, they had essentially Game 0 of that series in the last regular season meeting in what can only be described as a crazy night. So it was April of 2012. Both teams pretty much knew they were going to play each other in the first round of the playoffs. It was 10 days before the playoffs started, and the game was over. The Flyers were up 6-3 with about a minute remaining in Pittsburgh. But maybe to set the tone, or I'm not sure what the thought process was, Dan Bylsma, head coach of the Penguins, sent out both his fourth line and his third defensive pair. A lot of guys that can muck you up, like Aaron Asham and Derek Engelland. And Joe Vitale's hit on Danny Briere started a big gathering. I don't know if I'd necessarily call it a line brawl, but a lot of players on the ice found their dancing partners. Wayne Simmons and Derek Engelland went at it, but what is most remembered about this altercation was Tony Granato, Penguins assistant coach, and Peter Laviolette, Flyers head coach, standing on the benches, going at it, talking to each other. That's saying it nicely. They were screaming at each other. Peter Laviolette definitely thought that Bylsma was trying to maybe injure his players or set the tone in a game that was already over. And like both teams knew, they were going to meet again pretty soon. And they did in the 2012 first round, which still to this day, I'm not trying to make this video about me, but it might be the most frustrating series I have ever seen as a Pittsburgh Penguins fan and hockey fan in general. Marc-Andre Fleury, what were you doing this entire series? I don't know. It was certainly, probably the most entertaining series I've ever seen. Chaos is the number one word I would use to describe it. Pretty much after every whistle, there was some sort of extracurricular activities with guys just wrestling and then dropping the gloves. When it was all said and done, the series featured 12 fights, 312 penalty minutes, and 54 total goals in a 6-game series. The Flyers won the series. Yeah, they won the series. The biggest extracurricular activity happened in Game 3 in Philadelphia, as just mayhem ensued in what would become an 8-4 Flyers win. There were several scrums in the game, but none more famous than what Sidney Crosby instigated after he so casually knocked Jacob Voracek's glove away from him while he was trying to pick it up, and everyone found a dancing partner, most famously Sidney Crosby and Claude Giroux, the two superstars going at it. It wasn't too crazy of an actual fight, but they still got into it. Kimmo Timonen and Chris Letang, though, they threw some hands. And the series was just madness at this point. Sidney Crosby, after the game, did his famous "I don't like them" quote. And I'm a Penguins fan, but I can admit the Flyers, honestly, probably, and Crosby may even admit this himself, they got in his head. Giroux, too. And in what would go on to be the final game of the series, Claude Giroux had the shift. 30 seconds into Game 6, Giroux won the face-off clean off the opening dot, crushed Sidney Crosby with a big hit, and scored a goal. And the Flyers went on to win the series, and the national TV audience passed the torch to Claude Giroux. But the Flyers ended up losing the next round against the New Jersey Devils, and the Penguins looked themselves in the mirror after a couple more playoff losses against the Rangers. They changed general managers, they got Jim Rutherford, they got Phil Kessel, and so many other important pieces, and all of a sudden they were winning cups again. While they didn't have to go through the Flyers in 2016 and 2017, the Pittsburgh Penguins won back-to-back Stanley Cups yet again, defeating the San Jose Sharks in 2016 in 6 games and the Nashville Predators in 2017 in also 6 games. Sidney Crosby won back-to-back Conn Smythe trophies. The Flyers at this point were not the greatest team in the world, but they were still sneaking into the playoffs at some points, and they did in 2018. And the Penguins were looking for a three-peat, and they ran up against the Philadelphia Flyers in what is the most recent Stanley Cup playoff series between these two teams up until a couple days from now. But the Penguins pretty handily beat the Flyers in 6 games, improving their record against the Flyers all-time in playoff series to 3 wins, and the Flyers still have 4. But Jake Gensel and Sidney Crosby went off that series. Both of them had 6 goals and 7 assists for 13 points in 6 games. The Penguins were certainly looking for the 3rd straight Stanley Cup. They unfortunately lost to the Washington Capitals. That is a whole separate rivalry. Also around this time, and certainly worth noting, the Penguins and Flyers took their rivalry outside in the 2017 and 2019 Stadium Series. In 2017, the Penguins hosted at Heinz Field and won the game 4-2. In 2019, the Flyers hosted the game at Lincoln Financial Field and won the game in overtime thanks to Claude Giroux 4-3. So finally jumping into the 2020s, the current decade that we are in, I do want to mention a storyline that maybe some people don't remember as well as I do, but I certainly definitely want to mention it, and that is Oscar Lindblom, a bottom six forward who was drafted by the Flyers and came up into the league and unfortunately was diagnosed with cancer in December of 2019. Specifically, Ewing sarcoma. I'm not sure if I said that right, but he had cancer. And similar to how the Flyers treated Lemieux back in the day, Penguins fans gave him a standing ovation in March of 2021 at PPG Paints Arena. And honestly, in the 2020s, both the Penguins and Flyers haven't been too hot of teams up until now. Penguins have fiddled out after the back-to-back cup runs. The Flyers also missed the playoffs for a good substantial bit, but none of that matters because right now, we're matched up again. I'm not going to go over my series preview for that, but that's where we are right now. Both teams look a lot different from what they did in 2018 or 2012. Brian Rust, Sidney Crosby, Chris Letang, and Evgeny Malkin are still on the team from the 2018 series. And for the Penguins, Sean Couturier, Travis Sanheim, and Travis Konechny are still on the team from the 2018 series for the Flyers. Claude Giroux famously left from the Flyers after playing 1,000 games there. And we're going to have a fun series this year. I do have a couple other things I want to talk about before I end this video. But in terms of the chronological timeline, we're caught up to the year 2026. I do want to mention a couple double agents that played for both the Penguins and the Flyers. I mentioned Jaromir Jagr, Mark Recchi, Paul Coffey ended up playing for the Flyers. John LeClair briefly played for the Penguins. And Jeff Carter, after years with the Kings, ended up playing for the Penguins. There's also Rick Tocchet, Shel Samuelson, Ken Reggett, Mark Friedman, and plenty other names, but I did want to mention, obviously, Jagr, and Max Talbot, too. And finally, I want to go over just some raw statistics between the Penguins and Flyers, comparing them, especially given that they came into the league at the exact same times. The Pittsburgh Penguins have 5 Stanley Cups. The Philadelphia Flyers have 2. The Philadelphia Flyers have the better record against the Penguins all time in the regular season as of right now. They also have 4 playoff series wins against the Penguins 3. I also made this infographic, which I'll post down in the description or on my Twitter or anything like that. I had fun with this. I like being better than the Flyers. And that's kind of where we are right now. And wrapping up this video, I want to rip the bandage off. I hate the Flyers so much. I hate their fans. I think they are mostly pretty bad human beings. They throw crap all over the ice as soon as things start to go bad. They're obnoxious, rude to kids and people that are trying to enjoy the game of hockey. I hate the fans. I hate a majority of their players that have ever played for them. Even players that I like that go to Philly end up becoming assholes. I'm so excited for the Pittsburgh Penguins to beat the Flyers in 5 games. Sidney Crosby is not aging. He doesn't age. He's going to own them this year. He is their daddy. He is the owner of the Philadelphia Flyers, and it's going to be a pretty easy 5-game series win. And I can't wait to see Trevor Zegras get pounded to the ice by Connor Clifton or Elmer Soderblom. It's going to be a fantastic series. The Penguins they're going to smoke them.